American, I'm 60% a man. That's what Parity says I am. That's the law of the land. Now do I work 60% of each day, eat 60% of my meals? And does my truck take me into town on 60% of its wheels?
Hey, welcome to United Front Radio. This is Kyle McCarthy, and I am joined again by Daniela Walls of the Tax Wall Street Party, our friend James Hinton, who is a candidate for United States Congress in California's 5th District. We're happy to have James with us today. The song we just heard was called 60% by Pete Seeger. It is about the issue of parity agriculture, and we're going to be doing something a little bit different this week, which is to have a discussion about a conversation we had last night with an expert on parity, and then we're going to play that pre-recorded conversation. This issue, we've had a bit of a hard time getting it to take traction in people's minds, and it's just hard to understate how important it is in terms of the real economy, but also in terms of the New Deal. I'm going to read something from Franklin Roosevelt's speech called The Forgotten Man from April of 1932. He says, "How much do the shallow thinkers realize that approximately one-half of our whole population earn their living by farming or in small towns whose existence immediately depends on farms? They have today lost their purchasing power. Why? They are receiving for farm products less than the cost of them growing these farm products. The result of this loss of purchasing power is that many other millions of people engaged in industry in the cities cannot sell industrial products to the farming half of the nation. This brings home to every city worker that his own employment is directly tied up with the farmer's dollar. No nation can long endure half bankrupt. Main Street, Broadway, the mills, the mines will close if half the buyers are broke." I think this gets at the essence of parity. So I think we'll just start this by talking a little bit about what we talked about last night, and then just in general, what is the sort of national discussion about agriculture that's going on right now?
People our age, millennials, let's call them, I don't know if that's completely accurate, but let's give or take a few years, have never even heard the word parity.
So let's just start with a very basic overview. Parity is a price floor based on the cost of production, more or less. And so you look at, a farmer's got to buy a tractor and fuel and seeds and labor and whatever else goes into growing a bushel of corn. Mm-hmm. You can use statistics to say, okay, on average, corn costs $10 a bushel to grow. I think that's roughly the actual parity cost today. And it's a number that roughly means a fair cost of production. People around the country in different places have a different actual living wage, but for the whole country, you can just say $15 is a living wage. And this, interestingly, a living wage, in terms of the minimum wage, has been almost exactly equal to the parity cost of a bushel of wheat since like the 1950s. So you can look at what is a fair cost to produce a bushel of wheat. It's about $15. During the New Deal, from about, I think it first came in about 1933, from then until 1952, there was a price floor put under these commodities. And that functions, it's a government loan guarantee. So the government comes in and says, we agree that at the end of this growing season, we are going to buy, or we will buy that number of bushels of corn at whatever, $12 a bushel. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the year, General Mills and whoever needs to get corn so they can continue to function. They know they've got the offer of, it was set at about 90% parity. They've got that offer sitting out there, so they've got to beat that offer to get the product. And so the government basically functions as a threat to the grain mills and to the exporters and all these to the grain cartel. The farmer has a standing offer for a fair cost of production in the case of like the 1940s for 90% of the fair cost of production. This functioned very, very well, and the farms did well. There were a lot of farms, and they did so well that in the early 1950s, Eisenhower came in, and he has an infamous quote, which is, "We're going to stop mollycoddling the farmers." And they took parities. Basically mean babying. Uh-huh. Like these guys are constantly whining for their fair price. And so Eisenhower comes in and cuts the parity rate from 90+% down to 60%. That marks the beginning, the 1950s through the 1980s, sort of mark an era of...
I just came from trying to help get Dan Buhrdorf on the ballot for U.S. Senate in Nebraska, and I spent days out on the street petitioning for that and speaking. I spoke to about 10,000 people in the week that I was there. So now I'm in Napa in the wine growing region in California, and it's a total different landscape. But when I was out petitioning in Nebraska, none of the younger farmers knew what price parity was, and all of the older farmers knew what it was, and they couldn't believe that somebody was talking about it again. So I spoke to a lot of guys in John Deere caps, in their 70s about what parity was.
Yeah,
it's so simple yet so complicated. Sorry.
You need some incentive to care about it. My own...
Right.
My grandmother, I have some stories and old family photos and stuff that she put together, but her farm was one of the ones during the Depression that was just crushed, and they were literally... the kids were dressed in flour sacks, they were on the verge of starvation,
Mm-hmm.
And the parity price came in, and that saved all these farms in the Midwest and throughout the Plains states. It's you think about that, the Dust Bowl. What was the Dust Bowl? It was low prices. It was that the price was below the cost of production, so nobody could afford to basically improve their soil. Nobody could afford to farm on good land. It was people were racing westward in a race to stay ahead of the price of land, so that they're farming on crappy land, using crappy methods because there's no support for the price.
As they're scrambling to get any crop yield they can just to turn it in, and they're not thinking ahead. The myth about the Dust Bowl is obviously that they were using outdated, poor farming practices, and they just didn't have the technology to know how to use the land. But you're saying it was economic.
Yeah, it was completely economic. Why would you farm in Oklahoma if you can farm in Iowa? Just meaning, if you look across the corn belt of the United States is where it is for a reason, because it's the former prairies. It's basically where the glaciers stop. So you've got a foot or 2 feet of just beautiful black soil stretching from Nebraska to Indiana or thereabouts.
Mm-hmm.
That's why this has been the big growing region, and it's just the poorer farmers got pushed out from those regions because the price of land was too high, and because the price of grain was too low. So they had high costs and low income, and they couldn't survive there, so they just get pushed to where they can survive. And just to conclude the family story, my grandmother up in the area like Appleton, Wisconsin, which is up pretty far north, the New Deal comes in and their farm gets saved, and they're able to put the kids through school and raise a family or whatever, and they named her brother Franklin after Roosevelt. Just Mm-hmm. He was such a hero to the people of that time, and it gets all papered over by propaganda these days, but it was just, this parity issue was so important at that time, and it's such a tragedy that gets forgotten now.
Are you emotionally connected?
Yeah, I am.
Modern activism is covered over by, what did you say, just covered over by so many different layers,
mm-hmm.
that all of the common sense, realistic New Deal ideas are just completely lost. In order for me to explain something as simple as a price parity,
mm-hmm.
out here in California, it was much easier in Nebraska. Trying to talk about price parity out here, you're going to get 100,000 well buts. There's going to be a but for everything. Well, but does that mean there's a price parity for people who aren't organic? Does that mean there's a price parity for people who are growing GMOs? Does that mean there's a price parity? Does that mean Monsanto? And by the time you're done with the conversation, nobody even knows what a price parity is.
Mm-hmm. To paint with a broad brush, what would you think is a typical career for the type of person you've been talking to?
I would say, well, it varies in California, right? So you have urban professionals, it's obviously the largest agricultural state
mm-hmm.
in the country for produce, but you have landowners. California land is very expensive, and then you have Mexicans picking the produce. So I don't know what scale of it. I don't know what scale agriculture is an employer out here, but the people I'm talking to are shopping at the farmers market, and they have professional jobs. They're not
right.
They might have home gardens, but they don't have 1,000-acre farms.
And as we talked about last night with the man's name is Brad Wilson, and we'll play that interview in just a bit. We asked him So the big problem with Parity is that the prices have just gone down from formerly, 100+% of parity or the fair price to now 40%, sometimes 25%. Mm-hmm. We've had some of the lowest price years in recorded history just in the last, 10 years. We asked him, how do these farms stay in business? And the answer is they don't,
Right.
It drives it home when you put it into that sort of a personal context. You think of these people losing that. Hold on a second. I'm sorry, I'm getting all.
I'm saying that it's important for people, even if you're embarrassed momentarily, for people to see that you're emotionally connected to something like price parity, because people don't have any emotional connection. They have emotional connections to polar bears. They don't have any concept of the cost of, to human life and to livestock, as we'll find out in this interview, that a great way to stop the atrocity of factory farming is to incorporate livestock back onto the land. There are common sense human solutions to all this stuff, and people don't know how to connect to the financial planks on our platform because it seems too abstract.
The other thing is, I think, because those farms have been lost there in the past.
If we could make a movie of modern day farmers having to pack up their houses, generations of work put into a house, packing it up, but we don't have a movie because price parity is just not cause du jour. It's just not glamorous these days.
And the other thing is we need to make people connect to their own potential future. If you bring a parity price back, the price of corn has gone as low as $3 a bushel. We want to bring it up to 12, let's say. What that's going to do is you put it in terms of how many bushels of corn per acre can you produce given a certain acreage, given certain methods. You're going to find that all of a sudden, hey, wait a minute, I can actually have a small family farm and hope to turn a profit because there's a fair price for this. If I can beat this production target here, find some land, then like as a kid coming out of college, a 22-year-old can realistically make a living as a farmer.
Right.
Today you cannot make a living as a farmer unless you've inherited a ton of land, unless you're very experienced. Just the statistics, farmers are one of the oldest segments of the workforce. Just the number of working farmers that are 60, 70 years old is pretty astonishing.
That's what I saw in Nebraska. A lot of the working farmers were in their 60s and 70s. It's a highly skilled, almost a lifetime to learn, run a 1,000-acre farm.
If you have not been blessed or, cursed, whatever, however you want to look at it, with inheriting a farm or being a farmer today, a young kid coming out of an ag school at the University of Nebraska or the University of Illinois or whatever cannot just go be a corn farmer out of nowhere. And that was not true in 1952 or 1942. Just an enterprising, intelligent person could get a good education, figure out how to be a farmer, and make it happen because of that support in there.
Well, that's the same. I mean, to be honest with you, that's the same in every industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the same reason.
I don't know a single industry where it was as accessible as it was for our parents or grandparents.
It's hard to connect people to the issue of tariffs for the same reason. It's like, well, what are we protecting? We don't have any industries. Well, that's the point. You need to bring back protections so that you can have industry, so that you can have opportunity, so that you can have a ladder for someone to go from, the shop floor up to the management level or whatever it is.
That just doesn't exist anymore. I mean, I thought that at one point, about 10 years ago, it would be really great for me to be a flight attendant and work a few days a week. My father is an airline pilot, and my stepmother is a flight attendant, and she was a flight attendant for 40 years. My dad was a pilot for 40 years, and I said, well, I'd really like to be a flight attendant because then I can do my artistic pursuits, and I could work a couple of days a week and have medical benefits and all that. With my dad as a pilot for 40 years and my stepmother as a flight attendant with their recommendation letters and all their friends, I couldn't get the job. My stepmother said when she got the job, she walked right up to the ticket counter, filled out the application, and was hired on the spot. And said to start training Monday.
She just needed an ID and a mini skirt.
Yeah. But I thought the job was going to be what it was for my stepmother, where she got to travel the world, work a couple days a week, and do other things.
Yeah.
That's not what it is even if I got the job to start. They work you as hard as they possibly can. You're flying 5 days a week, domestic routes. Your benefits are all cut. You're overworked, overstressed, and you're getting only $1,200 a month after taxes. The point is it wasn't what I thought it was.
You know, and people, with that or with farming or with anything, a lot of times, and we've talked about this before, they blame technology. With the farms, it's, we're so much more, farming is more efficient these days. You don't need as many farmers on the land. It's all about the protection. Do you provide an economic environment in which somebody can survive at a fair price? And if you do that, then you don't need robotic tractors. You know what I mean? The robotic tractors are a response to low prices. The rescheduling of flights is a response to low... everything is a response to the fact that...
Wall Street extracts.
We live in a black hole where there's a big lamprey stuck to our head, and,
That's the perfect way to put it.
That's a terrible analogy.
No, it's not. That's what it is. Like, people can't... That's what it is. About we're all slaves to Wall Street.
Let's get into this, the pre-recorded interview. It's Daniela and myself with James, who I guess wasn't able to join us for this, and Dan Buhrdorf, who's the U.S. Senate candidate in Nebraska, and Brad Wilson, who is a working farmer in Iowa and also formerly with the National Family Farm Coalition, and he is going to talk to us a little bit about the history of parity, answer some questions that related to an issue that Dan is dealing with in Nebraska, and just go through some...
Also, we're dealing with out here, because I thought that parity was only going to apply to grains and livestock. We've come to understand that it also could apply to the produce that's grown out in California. Anything that's an orthodox variety of produce. I mean, it would be hard to put a price parity on, like, some strange version of a hybrid star fruit. What do you say to the Californian person out here who says they don't want to pay a parity price for food that's not organic? This is where they get hardline about it.
I would say that if the non-organic food is... If a fair price is enforced on that, more and more farmers are going to choose to grow organic, because you can now, if you're an actual family farm and you're getting double the income that you were before, well, now you don't have those same economic pressures to hire migrant labor, to, even like the use of pesticides or not soil building. Soil building is expensive in terms of when you're not being incentivized to do it. You've got to take your land out of production. You've got to grow cover crops. So it's when you've got X number of acres and you need every last penny out of those tomatoes or that corn or whatever it is. It's that the low price is what creates all the pressures to do the things that people should not be doing to land and to labor and everything else.
Ugh, I hate Wall Street.
We should text them and start a party to do that.
What a good idea! So let's go to Brad Wilson, who's the expert on parity.
Just to say that there are these econometric studies that have supported these policies over the years, and so I had some charts from some of those early studies of the 80s. Saying like, we'll make a lot more money on exports. Those were from FAPRI. But anyway, I sent an email on that. There's too many emails to look at real quick, I know, but at least it's there for what I'm saying now. You have it there.
And I think, Brad, I think all of us on the call, I have a little bit more knowledge of this stuff just having read Unforgiven and being familiar with some of the subject matter, but I think the others may not be so familiar with ag policy, but even farming in general. And I think ultimately we're trying to figure out how do we communicate these policies toward a lay audience in the best way.
Yes,
and so,
yes, and that's kind of my focus a little bit. One of my thoughts is that parity, one thing that it is just to say we need standards for fair prices, just as we have a standard for a minimum wage. We also need a standard for farm prices. So then you can have a standard versus not having any standard at all, like having no minimum wage. Okay, so that's the first part of the issue that in the way I talk about it. And then the second thing is, what should the standard be? Where should you set the standard? The parity means that generally that you have a standard set so that you'll get a price that's at the standard called parity that has been developed. So it's a level, and that level would be called 100% of parity. 100% would be meeting the ideal standard. Something else lower than that would be below the standard. Something higher than that would be above the standard. So then, unlike the minimum wage, there's also a part of these policies and programs that would have a ceiling over prices, so they didn't go too high. A price floor, so they wouldn't go too low, and then a price ceiling, so they wouldn't go too high. So they started this during the Great Depression and the New Deal to address the problem, which was basically that the free market was not working for the major farm crops, such as what we would call commodity crops, like the grains and soybeans and cotton. So over the long haul of history, so it wasn't just the fact that there was a depression. It wasn't a temporary measure in the Depression, although they might have emphasized the emergency. It was a problem that had gone on for 60 years prior to the Depression, and they've been fighting on it all through the 20s, and so then they got it passed. Okay, so then they had a price floor, and it's sort of like a minimum wage, and then they raised it up to the parity level eventually. So from 1942 to 52, as it is mentioned on some of my charts or shown on some of my charts, was the time, what we might call the parity years. Then, like one of the charts shows that we had 100% of parity or more for agriculture as a whole, but there are also then parity figures for individual crops, such as corn, wheat, and so forth, and milk, and for livestock. So then what should the standard be? So the way I talk about it is I say that when they put the standard at parity, that's not like today's minimum wage. Parity is like a living wage. That's how I talk about it. And I use the word living wage sometimes because people are more familiar with that term, and I use the term fair trade, a fair trade standard, because people are talking about things in those kinds of ways, and they're talking about raising the minimum wage to where the minimum standard is actually a living wage standard. And that's the same thing with parity. To have a standard is one thing. So you would say, well, is no one else here at least going to have a standard at all? Okay, well, the fact is then that the free market has not worked. What are the highest prices in history? What are the lowest prices in history? How do all the prices in history rank for crops like corn and wheat and so forth? And so for like corn and soybeans, after they got rid of all the price floors in 1996, then we had for corn 8 of the 9 lowest prices in history between 1997 and 2005. And the same thing for soybeans, and then similar for these other crops like wheat and rice and cotton and oats and barley and grain sorghum. Sugar beets is another crop in Nebraska, I see.
Yeah.
So the history of the Farm Bill is that they started the price floors, they put them up at parity. Actually, they had the price floor at 90% of parity, and then they had a price ceiling somewhere up above 100%, maybe at 110 or 120% or something up there. And then the price could move around in between there, and that was during, so that was to try to get a 100% parity price. And then starting in 1953, they started lowering the price floor down. That's basically the history of it. Until 1996, they ended it, although they weakened it in 85, and they ended the supply management, and they ended the reserves and the price ceiling and everything, except for a couple of crops. Sugar beets still has a price floor, but it's very low. And dairy, the last Farm Bill finally ended the dairy price floor.
What's been the devastation since they got rid of the price floor? What's been the fallout of all this?
Well, first they lowered it down, and we started having our prices below the cost of production, and then they totally got rid of it, and it went down even lower. Recently, for corn, rice, and soybeans, the price has gone up for a while, but now corn is back down to half of what it was a couple years ago.
And is it going to stay there? Is it going to stay low, or is it going to go back up?
Well, people argue about that. A couple of examples of what has happened would be, and this relates also to the question of livestock. What about the livestock farmer that has to buy things? Should he pay a fair price? Well, yes. But during the 1970s, we had Earl Butz, Secretary of Agriculture, and he emptied out the reserve supplies. So then they had the big secret Russian grain deal where Russia bought a huge amount of grain at cheap prices, and then the price went up, and the big corporations and the government knew about it. They didn't tell the farmers. So then that was really hard on livestock farmers because there was no reserve supply to put on the market to keep it from going way, above 100% of parity. And like rice, I think, went up to 140% or something. So there's different ones. But anyway, we weren't prepared for that. And then recently, we had these extremely low prices, and the low prices were also actually bad for livestock. They gave this below-cost feed ingredients to CAFOs, and they took all the livestock away. Now, just 4 corporations own 2/3 of the hogs in the United States. just 4 corporations. A lot fewer farmers have any hogs even owned by these corporations on their farms, and therefore that hurts having crop rotations and things like that. But anyway,
Say that again, please. You say that 4 corporations own 2/3 of the hogs, and then you said the hogs are on people's farms are actually owned by the corporations?
Yeah. 2/3 of them are owned by
crop rotation.
Livestock. If you have livestock, you can have some land in grazing. I jumped into this next idea, which is that having a fair price also helps sustainability and conservation and protecting the environment, because we want livestock to be spread out on the land, and we want farmers to grow hay, alfalfa, and clover. They can get a lot of their fertility in a sustainable way from alfalfa and clover, or nitrogen from the air. What are you going to use the alfalfa and clover for if you don't have any livestock? So it's a system that ties together. I've written some things about this, but anyway, that I can refer to. But anyway, so then it ties in with a lot of other issues. That's kind of how I would sum it up. You got this. You need a standard. What should the standard be? And then parity is also then a statistic, can show us what's been happening over time, and you can compare different crops with each other. For example, people were talking about how fairly are vegetables and fruits treated by the Farm Bill, and so I just put the prices in percent of parity and compared them. And it turns out that vegetable and fruit prices have gone down, not up, over time, but they haven't gone down as much as the grains and soybeans and cotton.
Brad, can you give us a sense of what was a grain farm like in the 40s and 50s versus now, in terms of acreage, in terms of their productivity, and that kind of thing? And basically, like, what are we missing out on by not having parity prices today?
One of the things I sent, and I don't know if I sent this to everybody, because that was my first one, but anyway, I sent some things on net farm income. And by the way, I have 2 kinds of data that I use to tell this story that are for each of the states, Nebraska and California. The data that it has each individual state only goes back to 1949 for net farm income. So then if you take that, you can adjust it for inflation so that it's in today's dollars. It's all equal. It should all be equal. And then you find that in the 1940s, when we had the parity standard, the net farm income was higher than almost every year after that. And that's true for the United States as a whole. Even with these higher prices we've had recently, we've averaged, on my figures, about the United States, about $25 billion a year below what we had during the 1949 to 52 part of the data. So then I've sent some charts, and I can send them to the others too. But anyway, where I show the numbers, like for Nebraska and for the United States, but also, how the recent period compares to the earlier period. Now, Nebraska actually had some, with the recent higher prices, which have been for corn, soybeans, and rice especially. They're the ones that have been above cost, where farmers have made some money. Nebraska actually had 3 years recently where they made more than in the 40s. And one of the things about comparing these 2 periods of time is we have a lot more productivity today. So we get about 4 times as many bushels to the acre for corn and so forth. So even with having much higher productivity, farmers actually end up getting paid less.
Even when they're going into profit? In the last 3 years, they're still getting paid less, huh?
From 2007 to the end of the data in 2011, for Nebraska, there were 3 years that were higher than the average of the 40s, and there were some others that weren't. Now, Iowa was still lower for these recent years of higher prices than it was during the 40s. Now, these net farm income figures, they also include other kinds of crops and livestock also, how well livestock was doing. And if you're a state like California, the net farm income would also include fruits and vegetables. There's a lot of that out in California, not much in Iowa, and so forth.
So Brad, what you're saying is that farmers are making more money now, but if you take into the amount of productivity that's increased, they're actually making less? Yeah,
they're making less per bushel, a lot less per bushel. During the 1940s, corn was, $11 or $12 a bushel in today's dollars, okay? There've been a lot of talk recently. It could be mentioned in the debate, that we've had record high prices, but we have not had any record high prices. And the United States as a whole has not had record high net farm income either, although it's been much higher with some of these higher prices. For corn, the record high price for corn in 1947 in today's dollars is, something like $17, $18 a bushel. That's the record high price. Now, we have more productivity. I was looking at how many bushels of wheat and corn and so forth does it take to buy a tractor, and so that's gone up a lot. It was something that we talked about in the 1980s, one of the videos, I sent a link to a video that shows one of the farm leaders in the 1980s talking about took 4,000 bushels of wheat to buy a tractor, and then later it took 13,000 bushels. In the 1970s, of course, it took less. We did have a period of higher prices there.
Sorry, Brett. I was just saying I'm looking at an article from Nebraska here that is talking about how those prices went up to $7 or $8 in 2012, but now they've dropped back down below $5 a bushel and are headed down to $3.50 a bushel.
Yeah.
And it says the USDA predicts that they're going to stay below $4 a bushel until 2023. So even these guys, Dan, I think when Dan and Daniela were out on the streets campaigning in Nebraska, there's sort of a sense of people being high on the hog, but that seems to have fallen right.
Yes. So for these years from 2007 to 2013, corn, wheat, rice, and soybean prices were above the cost of production. I sent some data in one of the emails showing the cost of production. We had a long period of price where the prices of these crops were lower than the full cost of production as measured by, USDA. If you take the 8 major crops and add them up, then there's only 1 year where it adds up above zero versus the full cost, and that was 1996. And that was only 1 year between 1981 and 2006. So for all those years, most of those crops were below zero most of the time as measured by USDA. Okay, so we had this long period of these low prices. Congress wasn't doing anything about it, even though we had farmers talking about it. The farm crisis of the 80s continued on into 2006, and it was in that period that we had, again, a lot of the lowest prices in history, like 8 of the 9 lowest corn and soybean prices, and similar for wheat and rice and the other crops.
So in those conditions, where does a farmer's income come from? Like I've seen some data talking about how most small farmers, it's from off-farm income.
Yes.
But even for the big farmers, like how do these guys stay in business?
Yep.
And what is the subsidy program that seems like it has changed recently, and we're not really clear on what that is?
Yes. I'm sure there'll be some kind of a question on subsidies, too. One of the things about the parity programs is you don't need any subsidies. One thing that people don't know is that we didn't have any subsidies.
Another example of Wall Street twisting our federal government up so they can extract more.
I should make a note here. My subsidy chart that shows, the direct payments going back to the 30s, and there weren't any corn or soybean subsidies. So it's a big savings. You can save $95 billion over this, multi-year period of time to use for other purposes in the Farm Bill. But there's plenty of people that would like to have some more money, so it changes your whole strategy for talking about the Farm Bill. It's like you don't need as many food stamps if you'd raise the minimum wage to a living wage.
If you can clarify that, parity is a loan guarantee. It's not that the government is actually purchasing anything, but they are stepping in with a price floor that then the grain merchant has to respect. Isn't that right? That basically this costs nothing to the taxpayer.
Right. The mechanism is that's usually used is that farmers have a price floor loan, so they don't have to sell their crop. They can just get a loan on it, and then if the price doesn't go up high enough, they can just let the government have that, even if the price is lower, and they don't have to pay anything back. But on the other side of that, the government doesn't want to get left with anything that they can't sell or that they sell at a loss, so therefore the government manages the supply. They cut back on the supply from year to year so that they keep the price where it needs to be. Then it doesn't cost money. In the 1980s, they were talking about how I have some figures from the 1980s that were used during the 1980s telling about how the government actually made money on the program through 1948. And then I have some more recent data that shows what the costs were for crops like for soybeans. There were no subsidies until 1998 of any significance. And so soybean, there were hardly any costs for the soybean program. And the same thing for the rye program, whereas oats and barley and others had subsidies. But anyway, the rye program didn't get any subsidies, even though the price was being lowered down. The same thing for soybeans. The price was being lowered down. It was a bad deal, but the data does show that it didn't have to cost much money. So it was like a revolving fund with the loans. In the past, they had a method that was counter-cyclical. For corn and wheat and feed grains, the subsidy started in 1961, and I'll send you some information showing that. But anyway, cotton started in 1964, rice in 1967, and soybeans in 1998. The first method was what they usually call counter-cyclical, meaning they gave you a subsidy when you needed it. When they lowered the price down by lowering the price floor and then gave back a subsidy, farmers ended up getting less. So even though they got a subsidy, the price had been lowered so much that they got less than what they got before they had any subsidies. So, and if you use a parity standard and look at how much did the value drop below parity, then you can see that there are huge amounts. I made an estimate of this, assuming that you would need to cut back on production in order to get a parity price. You'd have to do some additional supply management. So like during the 1980s, when they'd already lowered the price floor down a lot, I just assumed that they would cut down on how much corn was grown and so forth in order to get a parity price. I used that to figure out what a parity value might be. So if you look at subsidies, you say, look at they're getting actually in 2005 it was something like $10 billion of subsidies, and then you'd say back to them, yeah, but that was the lowest corn price year in history. It was only $2 a bushel. Well, you're talking $2 in one place, and you're talking $10 billion in another place. So what I did is I took the $2 and translated it into billions, so you can compare it with the amount of subsidies. Compared to that parity standard, and then assuming that you wouldn't grow quite so much of these crops. But anyway, because you had to cut back to not have an oversupply, that overall, during that, if you put it in today's dollars, we're down by about, if you put all the figures in today's dollars, we're down by about $4 trillion in value to farmers, and then they got paid back about $500 billion or $500 billion in subsidies. If you put the subsidies all in today's dollars, going clear back to 1961. The subsidies kind of cover it up, and then farmers get blamed for the subsidy, even though with subsidies, farmers keep getting less and less. The programs were so that if you had a low price, then you got more subsidy. And then they changed them. They said, well, that violates free trade agreements, they think. So therefore, they came up with this thing of giving you subsidy whether you need it or not. And here we'd had this 25 out of 26 years where we always needed it, but then we had a few years of higher prices. And then people were saying, look, you're getting a subsidy even though we have higher prices, the direct payments. So they changed it around, and then now they've changed it again where they're kind of hiding the subsidy and calling it crop insurance, except that it's crop insurance for cheap prices. Basically, they say, we're going to have insurance companies give farmers insurance to protect them against the zero price floor and keeping cheap prices. Well, that's no corporation is going to do that. Is going to give insurance to farmers to protect against the risk that where there might be low prices, because usually we've had low prices throughout history. So one thing about crop insurance is, why do you have to be subsidized to buy insurance? Well, partly because they're not paying you a fair price. So if you paid a fair price, then you could buy your own hail insurance. I mean, they still need maybe a government program to save up some money for a time when there's a 4-year drought or something. That's a bigger thing than what an insurance company might be able to deal with. But the idea of insuring against 25 years of prices below the cost of production, they have to subsidize the corporations, the insurance companies, otherwise they wouldn't do it. And that's why we have this controversy over taking some of the subsidy from farmers and giving it to insurance companies, so then they can make it look like it's risk management. See? They call it risk management because they're making farmers buy insurance, to kind of help pay for their own subsidy. This thing about the higher prices lately, I want to say something about that. This economist that you'll see that I refer to a lot is Darrell Ray from the University of Tennessee. He points out that there were only 3 times of higher prices in the 20th century, that were significant. There was one in World War I, there was one in World War II, and there was one in the 70s. A little tiny one in 1996, but those are the 3. And then in addition, and then some of that was covered up by the fact that we had a good farm program, a parity program during some of those years. So and if we had not had those parity and even lower price floors, the price would have been even lower on all these other years. But during the World War II, the parity programs were helped by the fact that of the war, and that made prices. So there are only 3 times. So he tells it. The way Darrell Ray tells it. Well, if you want to say, the free market works great, and therefore you don't need these programs. Well, yeah, that was true 3 times in the 20th century for a few years each time. But that's like a clock that's broken. It's still right twice a day. So we're having one now in the 21st century. We've already had a time of higher prices, not as high as the 70s, but it's kind of gone on for a longer period of time. Maybe we had one here, and then and then people increased production. We had land in the Conservation Reserve Program. A lot of that land has come out. So it's not known what will happen. There is more purchase for ethanol today, for example, but it's not known exactly what will happen. People have, all the politicians have joined around the idea of ethanol. You don't need a farm bill, we can do it with ethanol. The problem is that, that doesn't do anything, for example, for the dairy farmers. It doesn't give you a reserve to prevent things from going too high. And we had, it didn't do much, it didn't do any good for 2005 when we had the lowest prices in history and those other, By the way, when they got rid of these programs, one little key fact is that we had 4 emergency farm bills, 1998, 1999, 2000, and 2001, because the farm bill failed. The 1996 farm program failed, and everybody was going to go broke really quick, so they came back and they were going to totally end subsidies. They came back and added a whole lot of extra subsidies in to cover up the fact that the farm bill had failed. They had 4 emergency farm bills in that time period. So that's other evidence that supports this whole thing.
Maybe this is self-evident, but who is against parity? I would have to assume you've got, the grain cartel like Cargill,
right,
and then insurance companies, and then commodity futures traders. But why would any farmer not be supportive of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've had, surveys of this over the years, and the majority of farmers have usually supported it. Today, there hasn't been much talk about it, so it's hard to know what a survey would do, but you wonder if the young farmers even know about it, because it's been about 20 years since we had a price floor. And one of the things I emphasize is just a balance. It's got the top side and the bottom side. Our current system, the farm share of the food dollar is another statistic that we keep getting smaller and smaller. And one guy, he's taken the farm share, and he says, part of the farm share goes to Monsanto and John Deere and the input complex. So he found a way to take that out, and then the farm share is even smaller.
Excuse me, Brad, what do you mean by the term farm share?
If you buy some food,
yeah,
how much of that money goes back to farmers? So in recent years, it was down below 20%, but that included some of the money that went on through the farmer to Monsanto and John Deere and all those companies that sell to farmers. So those who sell to farmers, they want you to plant fence row to fence row the maximum production so they can sell more product. And so they're against these programs. That's one group that's against these programs. And then those who are buying the commodities, that would be the food and feed mills, the ethanol. In ethanol, by the way, the corporations like ADM that are big in ethanol, they lobby for cheap prices, and they're very powerful. On the other hand, where farmers have invested in ethanol, they've done it so that, if they're going to lose money on corn, well, maybe they won't lose money on ethanol. And then if the corn price goes up, at least they'll be making money on corn, even if it's hard on ethanol. I mean, there's groups. So we have, for example, an alternative corn growers association, the American Corn Growers Association, that has been for parity. So there is a commodity group for parity. Another commodity group to pay attention to is the RCAF. They're sort of an alternative because the Farm Bureau and most of the commodity crops have not represented farmers' interests. My definition, very simply, for farmers' interests, 1, fair prices for farmers, above the cost of production at least, and 2, keeping farmers in business, and 3, keeping it where farmers own the livestock, the value added of livestock. So anybody who's supporting things that have resulted in livestock being taken away from farmers doesn't represent farmer interests. So that takes out the National Pork Producers Council, and then when we had the pork checkoff, farmers voted it down. Obviously, the beef people, they probably, in that I saw running this debate, they probably want the checkoff. But if they're going to use the money to, support the livestock being owned by just 4 corporations, then it's not a good thing. That's how I would talk about it.
Can you tell us about the National Family Farm Coalition? Are you still involved with them? And sort of what things do you work on?
I'm working on some other things now, so I'm not on the board at the moment, but I have been on the board. And it's if you think of we had I don't know how old you people are. I am 61, but anyway, so my dad was involved in these issues back in the 1960s. I remember even my grandfather talking about some of this stuff back in the 50s. But anyway, even though I didn't really get much out of that, but so I actually attended a milk dumping to protest cheap milk prices as they were lowering the price floor in milk back in the 60s. But anyway, so my dad was involved in these issues, and in the 70s there was the tractors were camped out in Washington. So farmers have been fighting against this. The NFO was the lead group. In the 60s, we had the American Agriculture Movement coming along for parity. They were big in that, going to tractor cage and camping out on the mall in Washington for months. And then in the 80s, we had all these different groups and coalitions forming. So that whole movement, which was a huge movement, at one time in the 60s, the NFO mobilized 1 million people to come out to meetings in 6 months in 19 states. The movement, the food movement today doesn't really know about this, and most of the public doesn't know about this. It's kind of forgotten. But anyway, so all of that whole huge movement, the ones that are carrying that forward today in terms of this kind of policy would be the National Family Farm Coalition and the National Farmers Union, which has started doing it again. And they have a proposal. So both NFFC and NFU have these proposals, and I sent a thing given the links to talk about some of the proposals and actually the studies related to the proposals. So anyway, then during the 1980s farm crisis, we had this proposal called, by various names, the Save the Family Farm Act, the Harkin-Gephardt Farm Bill, Tom Harkin and Dick Gephardt from Missouri, Tom Harkin, Iowa, Senator Dick Gephardt, representative from Missouri, and others were signing on to it. And we had these various progressive Democrats that were supporting it. And it wasn't setting it all the way up at parity, but it was moving in that direction. It was, it got a lot of votes in the Senate and got a bunch of votes in the Senate and the House. And it was supported by, Daschle and Simon and Wellstone and so forth. But anyway, when Harkin became chairman of the Senate Ag Committee, where he actually had some clout to do something, he didn't think it would pass, I think. So he dropped it and ended up doing a zero price floor, Republican freedom to farm, but, with, I call that freedom to farm with a green face kind of thing. So that it would have, token amounts of money for different kind of progressive causes, but it wouldn't have a fair farm price. So it was helping all the big corporations against farmers.
Brad, I've seen some videos you did on YouTube criticizing Michael Pollan, or sort of what is today thought of as the food movement, just basically for not having any conception of these economic issues. I mean, can you talk about sort of what is the political environment we're in, and why are these people calling themselves the food movement failing farmers by not addressing these issues?
This is a very interesting question for us, too, out here in California, because there's a lot of people who believe that a family garden can feed the world. And we'd like to know the answer to that, too, out here, because we encounter that a lot.
And if you go to my, and I'll send this link out again, but anyway, I don't think I said, but anyway, my top video on my Farm Bill and Food Bill playlist is my best one. And that goes through in a kind of comprehensive way to sum up some of these things. But here's the thing, for all these decades of this earlier phase of the movement, we were saying we need the consumers to join us. I actually have a video on my playlist there that is from the Donahue Show in 1985. I think I call it, something like Food Movement 1985, because that's the audience I'm trying to reach. Were you there? We were. So it's a video, a little video excerpt, and it has me in it and some other people in 1985, saying that we want price floors, we don't want subsidies. Now today, we actually have this consumer side movement, and it's like a miracle. The movement, the movement is against cheap food. They don't want cheap corn prices and cheap sugar beet prices. They want them to be higher. They're actually better than the Farm Bureau and the corn growers, except they don't understand how the Farm Bill works. Their rhetoric is that it's like a miracle that they're not saying, hey, we want cheap food. We're the consumers. They're saying we want to pay more, so that we don't have cheap feed going to CAFOs. They understand that issue. They don't want export dumping on other countries. They don't. And by the way, export dumping, they call it, where we export at a loss. When I talk about that, I always emphasize that the United States loses money. So we had these prices below full costs for 25 years or for 30 years in a row for wheat and cotton and oats and barley. pretty much 30 years in a row. That's losing money on our exports for all that time. That's who's for that policy? Why is everybody for that policy? It's a stupid policy. But anyway, the food movement, they think that the way you can raise prices is take subsidies away from farmers. And so there's attention to that's one of the reasons why I did these charts and things to show that the farmers were reduced by $4 trillion and they got back $0.5 trillion in subsidies. They were reduced by $8 for every $1 they got back in subsidies. I'm trying to say, okay, we already have this movement that can support this whole thing. So one of the things you should say in your debate is, I don't know what you should say, but anyway, the food movement misunderstands the issues of parity, for example, but they support the general idea of paying a fair price to farmers. So we need to teach them how to do that. You go to the food movement and say, hey, food movement, how much do you want to charge CAFOs for buying, how much do you want to charge the junk food companies for buying corn and soybeans? Set it up, how about parity? Why charge them any less? Yeah, so farmers kind of get blamed because it's thought that farmers have benefited from the Farm Bill, and it's thought that, for example, farm state senators and representatives have been, helping farmers for decades in the Farm Bill. But what my numbers show, all the farm states are losers because they've had big reductions below parity, and the subsidies have only made up for, on the overall average, only $1 for every $8 of reduction. So, and that's, and Nebraska is no different on that. So that's the other category of things I have for each state is how much each state has had as a reduction. And I can also do something for you on Nebraska and on California. Again, California's a little different. They don't have, because this is only looking at commodity crops and that part of the Farm Bill that's tied in with subsidies. I also look at parity for fruit and vegetable crops. And what I find is that if you take the price of the commodity crops and then add subsidies on top of that, and then you look at how much is that as a percent of parity of what it should be, then the commodity crops are still lower in price, even with subsidies. The amount of subsidy per bushel, for example, the commodity crops are still lower than about all of the fruits and vegetables as a percent of parity. I have that data. So anyway, I'm putting up a bunch of these slides on SlideShare. Finally, I used to have them up at another place as part of photo albums, and I also have them at Facebook, a bunch of them at Facebook, if anybody wants to friend me at Facebook. But I'm putting up a SlideShare, and they'll be so people can see. So right now I have 2 slideshows up there, and they kind of show some of these things there. That's that shows some. But anyway, so that's my answer kind of for the food movement, including the environmental people that are involved in the Farm Bill and people who are concerned about public health. So we have some big crises. We have a dead zone in the Gulf. We have people who, a big crisis of diabetes and people eating too much sugar. And a part of that is let's pay farmers a fair price for corn.
How does that affect diabetes and things like that and better health?
Well, they're saying because of these low, cheap prices for corn made into high fructose corn syrup and soybeans made into trans fats, and sugar beets made into sugar, it's kind of like subsidizing these corporations and below-cost junk food ingredients.
I see.
So that's the criticism of it.
Do you have anything to say about GMO corn and soy? Any criticisms of that, even just from an economic standpoint?
My thought about GMOs, I'm not for GMOs, and I'm actually organic. Unfortunately, the organic farmers are not supporting the parity, and the sustainable agriculture movement is not supporting these kinds of price floor programs. So that's one thing that I write about on the internet and try to tell people that's not right. Why would the organic farmers want to support cheap feed ingredients for CAFOs that are unsustainable? That's how I talk about it anyway. And by the way, when I talk about these issues here in Iowa, when I go to a political candidate, I say there's two sides. They want to say, we're for the livestock industry, and people are critical who are critical of CAFOs are against the livestock industry. What I say is the two sides are, on one side you have the 4 corporations that own 2/3 of the two-thirds of the hogs, and in Iowa they say the Chinese own 25% of our hogs. Okay, so that's one side, the 4 corporations. And then you could add 8 and 24 corporations that are also big corporations, and you'd be even higher than 2/3. And then the other side is for the farmers. So the farmers of Iowa and the nation voted down the pork check off because they didn't think it was going in the right direction. And by the way, and then how do farmers cope with that? That was your missing question. What do farmers do with this below-cost prices? Well, it's below full costs, and you may not notice it because it may not be below the cash cost just for that individual crop. So then if you consider your overhead and different things that they figure that they put into the data at the Economic Research Service. So it may not be below the cash, what they call the cash cost, but it is below the full cost if you can include these things like overhead and things. And people were critical of the subsidy programs because if you had a crop rotation with alfalfa or clover in it, red clover or something, you didn't get a subsidy on that. One of the things the Parity programs had, they also had a price floor for small grains like oats, rye, and barley. That would be part of a crop rotation. That would be a nurse crop with your alfalfa. So it helped you to have a crop rotation. Plus the fact that you had livestock and, the set-aside where you are careful not to overproduce because you want to keep the prices at the right amount. Then, so you take some land out of production. That also can be used to help get livestock back on the farm. And again, that will be fought by those who have livestock in KFOs. The government didn't necessarily bring you up to the cost of production, or they certainly didn't bring you up to parity. Remember, I said they only give you back $1 for every $8 you were dropped down below parity. That's about what my figures are on that. I don't know if anyone else has made an estimate of that, but I just developed a way to make a rough estimate of that. And it varies by crop. Dairy farmers get a lot less for each amount below parity. But anyway, one thing I might have mentioned, but anyway, most farmers have gone out of business under this program. So how did they cope with the cheap prices? They went out of business. Another thing is they find that in recent years farmers have gotten wealthier, and the extra wealth has come from off-farm income. I mean, just over the last 20, 30 years. In other words, who survived? It was the person with the better off-farm job. That's who survived. So there are a number of ways that farmers have gotten around this. They keep old machinery. I was talking to somebody the other day, saying, well, my tractors are from the 1960s, or maybe from the 70s. But anyway, so that's one way. Farmers have not necessarily had health insurance. Farmers have had a relative that inherited the farm, and then they're renting it to them extra cheap sometimes. So that'd be the farmer that survived when somebody else didn't. Then there's a gamble, because there can be more volatility without price floors and ceilings. There's more volatility, and so then, luck of the gamble, you might catch it on a better time. And then, so anyway, there's a long list of reasons. I've been going to collect these together and write them up as a list, because I was talking to some dairy farmers, and they were saying, I can give you a whole bunch of reasons on how you cope with this. It's a long list.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think from what I've seen, it seems like a lot of these other former importers, like Egypt used to import a lot of wheat from the U.S., these countries seem to be trying to protect themselves either with subsidies or some kind of price floor arrangement. I know India just sort of bucked the WTO on this, that a lot of these people seem to be trying to get out from being dependent on these cheap U.S. imports and are entering into this whole BRICS system where they are hoping to be exporters to Russia and China and sort of cut the U.S. out. I mean, do you see that as threatening the future of U.S. grain, maybe in a positive way, because we've got nowhere to run with exports, and it's going to create the conditions where something like this could come back?
Yeah.
We'll have to finish this, Brad, in the next segment, which will end up being the next episode. We've had the good fortune to access his knowledge and speak to Brad Wilson, a working farmer in Iowa and member of the National Family Farm Coalition. Brad is a prolific writer of articles on farm policy, a keeper of charts on ag statistics, and also has a great YouTube channel, Brad Wilson. Also a part of this discussion was Dan Buhrdorf, candidate for U.S. Senate in Nebraska, danfornebraska.com, and James Hinton, winner of the California 5th District primary for U.S. Representative, hintonforcongress.com. I'm Daniela Walls, National Chair of the Tax Wall Street Party, and Kyle McCarthy, founding member of the United Front Against Austerity and the Tax Wall Street Party. You can find us at againstausterity.org and taxwallstreetparty.org. You've been listening to United Front Radio at ucy.tv/UFR. Have a blessed evening.
I'm 60% an American. I'm 60% a man. That's what Parity says I am. That's the law of the land. Now do I work 60% of each day, eat 60% of my meals? And does my truck take me into town on 60% of its wheels?